Hello, everybody, and a special welcome to you. Thank you very much for joining us at Borderless Live. Today, we're going to have a conversation with Peter Vermeulen, really experienced executive with lives in the life sciences sector, in the industrial world, and also at Amazon. Joining Paul will be Paul Connolly, who is Vice President of Operations EMEA, currently with Goodyear, and also a former career within the Johnson & Johnson group on a worldwide basis. The question we'll be addressing today with our two guests will be, what can the life sciences sector learn from Amazon and other industries? And perhaps also a little later, what can Amazon and other industries learn from the life sciences sector? With that, I would like to introduce you to Paul Connolly, and when he's ready to go, we'll have his introduction. There we go, Paul, over to you.
Thank you, Andrew, and thanks for taking the time to invite me to this webinar. I'm delighted to be here today, particularly with my good friend Peter. A little bit about myself. I currently live in Belgium, but you can probably tell I'm not Belgian. Originally from Northern Ireland. Happily married with 3 children. I've spent my career, most of my career in life sciences, but now I'm in the tire and rubber industry. My background is, my primary degree is in manufacturing engineering. I have gone back to study medical science, business, finance, etc. I spent around 20 years in Johnson & Johnson. I started as an engineer, became plant manager, regional director of manufacturing, regional director of supply chain, global director of manufacturing, global vice president of operations, global VP of manufacturing. And my last role there was deployment of the system strategy and deployment of that linked to the Internet of Things and big data. So bringing together that complicated world of many different umbrella companies and how do you behave as one without losing entrepreneurship. I left Johnson & Johnson around, for most of those 20 years, I was actually based in the US, 8 years in New Jersey, 4 years in California. And then I took the opportunity to move to Belgium, where I joined a Goodyear tire and rubber company in charge of European operations. So it's around a staff of around 20,000 people when you include shop floor personnel, so a relatively large role in a heavy processing or chemical industry.
Thank you, Paul. Look forward to hearing your experience in all those places and how they come together. And Peter, over to you. You're really up early in the morning. Peter, you're on the West Coast. Tell us a little bit how you started your work life.
Yeah, good morning, Andrew. Thanks for having me. Indeed, it's 5 a.m. in the morning here in Seattle. So I'm Peter Vermeulen, right? I basically am on my own right now as an HR advisor and a coach. But I was very fortunate to work 17 years for Johnson & Johnson. I started with Janssen Pharmaceutica in Belgium. And basically in 2004, I came to the US, also became American in the process. And after 17 wonderful years with Johnson & Johnson as a head of HR for multiple businesses, but also leading talent management and diversity and inclusion, I had an opportunity to move into Linde, which was industrial. I did that for a couple of years until basically got merged with Praxair. And then I basically moved to Seattle and I became the head of HR for what we call the customer experience groups. It's basically a group of 100,000 people worldwide in 19 different countries. And so really had an opportunity to, experience the culture firsthand. And I'm thrilled to be here with you all.
Well, that's great, Peter. Thank you very much. Wonderful series of experiences we're going to try and bring together during this conversation. Maybe we start with you, Peter, if we may. We've heard an awful lot about Amazon being the most customer-centric company in the world. How would I observe this within the Amazon culture, Peter?
Yeah, I could write a whole book about this, Andrew, to be honest. Let me give you a couple of examples of things that I found really intriguing, interesting. First of all, there is Jeff Bezos and his leadership team that basically reminds you that don't come up with competitive stories. I'm not interested in the competitors. I'm really interested about, tell me more about the customers. So hearing that every day, seeing that live, from your leaders, that is a cultural shift that is kind of refreshing to me. Second thing, there are multiple techniques that Amazon has in place to really start from the customers and work backwards. And every leader in the organization is being trained in these techniques. The other thing, they have an empty chair in the meeting room, just to remind people.
What does that mean, empty chair?
Well, the empty chair is basically the customer in the room, Andrew. So it reminds you when you're in a leadership discussion or any discussion, do we have the data points from the customer? Or what would the customer do? What would the customer think? So it's super refreshing. Last but not least, they have a set of 14 leadership principles. And in order to get recruited at Amazon, it's a very high bar. In order to get promoted, in order to get a solid performance rating, you need to be able to demonstrate that you are living these leadership principles. And the first one is being customer obsessed. It's not being, doing what the customer wants. It's being customer obsessed. And so they really teach you in terms of like, what does that mean? What do you need to do as a leader, as an employee?
Maybe, Peter, if I can interrupt you saying, give us an example of what it means to be customer obsessed. It sounds vaguely rude, but I'm sure it's not. What is it in practice?
Yeah, so let's take an example in the customer experience group. So one of the groups that I was supporting was the people that would take the phone calls from all our customers. And so one of the things that I don't know if you had that experience in working with Amazon, or sorry, if you buy on Amazon, if you return something immediately, once you basically ship your shipment back, you get reimbursed already. It's that type of example. We trust our customers. Our customers are always right. We're not going to check the contents of the package that you're going to send back. This is just an example, Andrew, of being customer obsessed. We trust our customers and we believe they're doing the right things, and basically we treat them as friends.
Very good. Would we see any parallels to that? What do you think, Paul? Is there any parallel to that you can think of in your experience in the industries you worked in?
Well, certainly Peter and I had a lot of discussion around the idea of where a business gets its value from. And as we spoke over the weekend, Andrew, obviously there's really three value disciplines. Are you a product leader? Are you operationally excellent in the way you do business to create competitive advantage? Or are you really intimate with your customer, i.e. that your customer thinks, as Peter said, your friends? I think Amazon certainly are getting their value from customer intimacy. I think within the life science business, there's a tendency to focus on product leadership and having that best product to solve a end consumer issue or an end patient issue. And I think there's an obsession around that in my experience within life science. There's an experience around that, and that's where most life science businesses create their value. Where there's maybe an opportunity to do more is that whole idea of the channel that serves the end customer, the end patient. Because in many cases, your customer in a life science business is not the patient, it's the healthcare provider, the healthcare trust, the government, if it's governmentally funded healthcare. So how can you focus on creating an ease of doing business? And that's really what Peter mentions. My experience would be that the ease of doing business with a life science company maybe isn't as pronounced as it is with Amazon. So how can a life science company take that concept of product leadership, but also supplement it with the whole idea of the provision in the healthcare? So blurring the lines between life science and healthcare. So patient obsession, maybe not customer obsession. It would be my experience of in the life science world.
That's nicely explained. And as far as I recall, Peter, our life sciences businesses from time to time, and perhaps not often enough, bring physicians and even patients into their environment into their meetings to talk about their real experiences. So I think there may be a parallel to that, but it's not necessarily an obsession, if I can be maybe a little provocative, sometimes an afterthought rather than an obsession, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. There's something else you mentioned in our earlier conversations, Peter, about this day one concept at Amazon.
Yeah.
I'm not sure I know what that means. Could you maybe explain that to us?
Yeah. All Amazonians would know what the day one concept means. And so Bezos also sits in a tower called the Day One Building. It's a concept that he has, is basically saying, okay, we're a company of 800,000 people now, and we're growing. By the way, Amazon has this ambition to kind of double in size in the next 2-3 years. So it's one of the top 5 companies in the world. But day one for him means we're still going to act and think as a startup. And so he's challenging everybody. And we also had to go through some leadership training about this, is to say, what do we need to do as leaders to make sure that we still operate like in a startup environment? I want it to be day one in Amazon every time. And so to make that real, for instance, we had to go through a yearly process, which I thought was really refreshing, Andrew. We had to kind of identify, what does day 2 look like? And can we come up with some examples that are very much like day 2? Like I remember in my area of responsibility, we started to reflect on what do we see a couple of examples of day 2? And what are we going to do about that? So there was one example where for a headcount approval, we needed like 4 or 5 signatures, and it was kind of creating bureaucracy, and it was slowing down our business. And so that was an example that we picked as very much day 2. And we kind of brought that to the leadership and say, we want to basically do something about that. And then you're empowered to do that. So it's very much like, how do we keep that entrepreneurial mindset in our business? It's very refreshing.
And you say this would be a quarterly meeting or a regular meeting that you have?
There is at least a yearly process, but you would talk about it like on a monthly basis in your monthly business reviews. But there is like a formal process every year, Andrew.
We understand for good reasons, of course, the pharma industry has to be conservative about many of the things it does. Life sciences does in general. Mm-hmm. Paul, how contradictory is that with what Peter has explained about bureaucracy and how all that fits together?
Yeah, I don't think it's just life sciences. I think businesses tend towards some degree of entropy, right, where chaos kicks in, and then you're stuck with driving functional excellence. For a company of Amazon's size to stay entrepreneurial, I think is amazing. You see evidence in some of the larger life science companies like J&J, where they're trying to reestablish that in pockets. Right, one of our prior colleagues is now the chair of the J&J Development Corps, which funds that enterprise and entrepreneurial development. The challenge can tend to be that when you try to fit that entrepreneurial mindset into any big engine, which could be life sciences or it could be any industrial company, it gets lost in the bureaucracy. And I think, Andrew and Peter, it kind of comes back to that discussion about the last circle. We talked about product leadership and customer intimacy, and then we talk about operational excellence. And as an operations guy, that's obviously first and foremost in my mind a lot of the time. I think it's misunderstood a lot of the time. I think when we talk about operations excellence, we think about bureaucracy, because we think about procedures which are self-foundational, functions which are departments which stand by themselves and therefore present a business case which isn't market back or shareholder back or customer back, but it's a loss analysis based upon maybe what they did prior year. So I think that as I've been discussing this with Peter, that concept of an entrepreneurial mindset, which doesn't necessarily break the necessity for strong process and strong systems, because Peter will probably talk about the strong systems and strong process. And I think what Amazon have probably cracked, which I've seen in other parts, which I'll talk separately on, but ensuring that operations excellence is the routine things that have to be done should be done without effort.
Mm-hmm.
The effort should go into doing the things which are exceptional. And I think that's where a lot of more established companies, be it life science or
Yes.
bigger industries, get stuck where they think bureaucracy and protocol are where they put their efforts, not the new and innovative. So I don't, whether or not it's called an entrepreneurial mindset, or it's, as an engineer, I'll say, do I focus 80% of my time on making sure the machine's polished and clean and oiled? Or do I spend 20% of the time doing that and 80% of the team trying to get the machine to work better?
Right.
And I think what you'll find a lot of companies have, the maintenance versus improvement, they're spending more time in maintenance versus improvement. Whereas when Peter describes what he sees about the day one culture, it's reinvent to improve. And I'm sure, Peter, that does not mean do not have standard processes, but it means constantly break the mold to move it forward and move forward consistently and together.
Yeah, that's a very good definition of the subject, Paul. Thank you. Before we go to any further, I just want to remind our audience that there is a Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. And if you have any questions to ask our two guests, just put your question and we'll see it coming up immediately. We'll make sure those questions get covered. We'll try and cover all of the questions during our session, during this conversation. If not, we'll make sure that you get answers immediately afterwards. So please don't hesitate to use a Q&A button. So Peter, there's something which you mentioned, which I thought was interesting. You know, in this area that you were personally responsible for, you had 100,000 people. I mean, you know, not many companies talking that scale. And you know, the whole HR organization around that must be absolutely horrendous. Lots of interviews and complex processes in most companies. What would I find at Amazon to do that?
Yeah.
How many people did you recruit in a year? You tell me that, Peter.
Yeah, I remember my first day at Amazon where my boss basically told me what my objectives were going to be. And I still remember that he told me is to say, you need to be able to hire 30,000 people a year. And I was like, what? 30,000 people a year. And I had no idea about how the Amazon machine was working and the culture, et cetera. And I didn't know the strength of my team. So I started, of course, making that a priority, really understanding how Amazon operates. But to give you an example of what I found out, and we hired them in a heartbeat. Because Amazon, the systems and the processes they have is all about how do you scale things. And so what I found really amazing, we had the system in place, it's called the lights out recruiting system. So no recruiters are involved. So basically what happens is for wage type of associates, people would go online. They would do a couple of tests, a capability test, a language test. And if people score above a certain threshold, they immediately get a contract. They can pick their training course. They're invited to the training course. And after the training course, they're being put in the role. So people are being hired without seeing a recruiter. So it's one of these examples where you basically have to interview select more than 100,000 people in order to select 30,000 people per year. And that was a smoothless process. It basically, so it's one of these examples that you go like, wow, this is just amazing. And it shows you the capability of like how they can scale up things and really create efficiency to certain processes.
Yeah.
Yeah, sorry.
I was going to say, I mean, this sounds like in a traditional business, whether it's life science or an industrial business, this would be considered extremely high risk, and high dropout rates and all of that. How's that avoided within the Amazon structure?
Yeah, so let me give you an example of another HR innovation process that we had. And this is what basically I took the lead together with my team on this one. We had some pockets in the organization where we had high turnover. And we were thinking, what can we do about it as we were looking at the numbers? And so my team, I had an HR tech team, came up with the idea to start using artificial intelligence to the problem. And so what we started to do is basically select 28 attributes, and artificial intelligence would basically bring all the data together into predictive data. And it would predict that somebody is at very high risk of leaving the company. And we would then equip the team managers with this information and say, hey, of your team of 15, 20 people, so-and-so is at high risk. And then we would train the team manager to basically have stay conversations with these people, as opposed, Andrew, later when people leave to have exit interviews.
Right.
So we kind of...
Well, that's an important concept, Peter. Stay interviews rather than exit interviews.
Yeah, so think about the cost saving for the company, the impact on engagement, etc. And the impact we had, we kind of reduced regrettable losses with more than 30% in some pockets of the organization. And the accuracy of that program, we call it Nostradamus, which is basically the crystal ball, right? This project was called Nostradamus, was so high that even team managers did not believe. They say, this person at risk? I don't believe it. And I remember a specific case where that team manager did not want to have a conversation because he didn't believe the data, and the person left the organization. So it was that accurate. But it shows you the power of artificial intelligence again, turning that into actionable insights and equip team managers to something that is really super valuable and that, delivers incredible value to the company.
That is indeed very, very impressive. How would I apply that in the world of Goodyear? Paul, what do you think?
Well, if I think differently about what Peter described, he's describing big data and the Internet of Things as a behavioral measure. So Peter, if I try to distill it down, it's you're taking data to predict the behavior.
Yeah, that's
and
right.
You're using the Internet of Things to do that. Okay, and that's because in Amazon, the major asset is the people who are connecting with the marketplace, right? The buying and selling. So it makes absolute sense that that's where, in terms of big data and IoT, that's where Amazon would focus. If I think about it in the life science business, and I'll come back to Goodyear in a second, the predictive analytics aren't used for behavior, they're used for product performance. So if you're making a pharmaceutical, obviously you can't measure the performance of the pharmaceutical, you validate the performance of the pharmaceutical, and generally using predictive analytics, be it at a big biomass chamber or even making a contact lens for a med device, you're predicting that when you make 5 billion contact lenses a year, that you're going to get the focal length right, and the machine will automatically reject anything that they think is going to cause an error down the line. So I think it's about the application of data. I don't think the life science businesses are using it so much for predictive analytics, but I can give you an example of where in my previous life in J&J, we tried to be more outward looking, but certainly be that robotic self-adjusting machines for making orthopedic joints or inspecting contact lenses or validating the parametric results that will lead to the release characteristics of a pharmaceutical. They're there. So it's whether or not they're being expanded beyond the area of what's seen as immediate need. I did have in my last role in J&J, I mentioned I sat between two stools. So I had a pretty unique job. I was 1 foot reported into operations and 1 foot reported into IT. So I was that integration point between system strategy and system deployment. The rationale behind that is J&J ran an umbrella organization with a lot of small companies that were meant to be entrepreneurial, small market-facing companies. Behind that, the system infrastructure, I think at one stage we counted over 3,000 SAP systems, right? So, and no talking. So a mountain of people to transfer data between systems. So if you think about it like that, instead of having a river of information, we had wells of information and we had water carriers, people who translated information between the systems. So we were trying to develop that to get more like what Peter's saying, because underneath what Peter's saying, the systems he's describing would connect other systems, not just be standalone. And it's the integration of the systems which gives you the gestalt benefit, right? The holistic benefit. We started to go into situations where we could predict, in J&J, we could predict consumptions by looking at Instagram feeds.
Oh, yeah.
So we would look at Instagram feeds and find out the product we're marketing in consumer goods. We could look and say, oh, we thought we were marketing this product to 50-year-old men. And yet, every time we catch an image of this product, it's surrounded by 15-year-old girls. We've got our market completely wrong. Now, that's an extreme example. But that gives you an idea how you can use big data now for that kind of market analytics. The other thing which I thought was a really interesting experience, and this is trying to get demand forecasting right and using big data for that, is we went into a back order on a product that that inbuilt into it was a cream. Inbuilt into it was mosquito repellent. We went into back order 2 months after in South America there was a massive outbreak of Zika, and what we found on a lot of Facebook and Instagram feeds was what's the best moisturizer to use to keep mosquitoes away. If we had done that before the fact, we could have had predictive analytics for supply. So not building the order, but building the future demand. So there's elements within Goodyear, again, bring it back internally, what we're trying to do. Is Goodyear's it's as much a chemical processing facility as it is a tire plant. So these plants are very large, and we're typically processing materials, and the material is alive until it's cured. So not dissimilar to a bioreactor in the biologics world. So it's live until it's cured. So as it's live, you've got to start trying to get data on the shop floor, which is looking at yield characteristics, flow characteristics, aging characteristics to predict the performance of the product. So we're a little bit, we're not as developed in there as I'd like, but we've certainly started that engine of using the data gathering to predict the performance of a product. And again, it's not about taking the big data and Internet of Things and applying it holistically. It's where you're going to create unique business and shareholder value. For Peter, it was evidently getting the right people in the right place. For a lot of other businesses, it may not be there.
Well, that's a wonderful way of explaining it to both of you. Thank you very much for that. Interesting questions coming up through our Q&A, by the way. You know, how would you transform a classic life science company, supply partner OEM, to make the kind of shift that Amazon has made? You know, it's a lot easier to do it in a very young company with a high growth rather than it is a more traditional environment. Do you think there's a difference between the two guys? Peter, what do you think?
I absolutely believe that, you know, the two industries are completely different, and but to be honest, I see a lot of opportunities when you think about transformational projects. This is what the question was all about. What can we do completely different? So I would basically start by, you know, talking about the culture and the cultural transformation. So let me give you an example, right? I worked 17 years in Johnson & Johnson, had the privilege of working there. And it's very much a consensus-driven, it was very much a consensus-driven company, and also a company that would basically take a lot of decisions based on PowerPoint, right? So a new idea was born. Let's do a PowerPoint. Let's make sure everybody has kind of agreed on before we come to action, right? Now you move into Amazon, where basically PowerPoint is completely forbidden. It's a very analytical environment, where basically people write docs, and basically they have all their facts and figures about new proposals in a doc, written in a doc. So you don't use PowerPoints, you basically use documents to convince your leadership team. So it's just an example of thinking differently, different leadership principles, different cultural environment, where basically people are more, focusing on the analytics, less than the PowerPoint, the fancy things.
Sure.
Exactly. Which is then, by the way, if you decide, I'm going to buy this proposal, you don't still have the details, because it's kind of sometimes fluffy. And it takes a long time to implement. In Amazon, you basically have your ducks in a row, as the Americans say, in a doc. Your leadership team basically makes a decision to implement it. Immediately you get the funding, and you get assigned resources to do it and put this in action. So it's a really different concept about, and I think that probably the truth is in the middle, so I think thinking about cultural components, how you can transform and infuse some new kind of more agile, quicker decision-making, more analytics into your processes. Think about scalability, think about leadership principle, think about customer obsession. These are all things that I believe life science can really start thinking about, and building a kind of a roadmap to address that. Does that make sense, Andre?
Absolutely, absolutely. Very well put. Paul, do you have any reflections on that, how to accelerate?
So firstly, I'm Irish, so I love the art of storytelling. Right, so
tell us a good story, Paul.
Telling a story with a document is much better for me than showing 100-page PowerPoint slides.
Sure.
I've seen in my current company, I've seen in previous companies that you may have a body of people whose job is to create the slides, the PowerPoint decks, and keep them updated for the latest thing. As an ops guy who really detests waste in all its forms, that always made me nervous, broke me out in hives, I think. What I saw in the time before I left J&J, I saw a change coming. So there was a few times when I had to present to the vice chair of J&J, and although we're still using PowerPoints, the PowerPoints came with a story behind it, and if there's more than 5 slides in the PowerPoint, it wasn't reasonable. So again, the PowerPoint was used to tell the story, not to have people look at a screen and try to hear you and try to read at the same time. And I guess with the document, you can't do that. You get a chance to read.
No.
Your core question, though, came back to, I thought, is it easier to build a new house or refurb an existing house?
Correct.
Yeah. Right? And it's obviously much easier to build a new house because you get a chance to get it right from the start. And I think what a lot of tech companies, including Amazon, have is that, and this is why I'm such a big fan of strategy, as we talk about the value disciplines. If you get your strategy right, then you have a chance to build towards that strategy resolutely. And everyone's aligned to the strategy and it's resolute.
Yes.
I had the experience in life sciences of doing that. So I had the absolute pleasure of starting up a new manufacturing facility in Ireland. And as we did that, we set the strategy from the start. And we had 4 steps in the strategy, which was key was we are going to be the products we've been asked to make, we're going to become the best within the world at doing that. Not the best within J&J, the best within the world. Because once you start driving internal comparison, you actually are just, sometimes you can hold your compete rate back because you want to look better. We want to be the best in the world. Then if we did that, we'd be attracting more business because we'll create shareholder value, create value for the business. As we do that, we'd branch out the circle and we'd look into where we could go beyond manufacturing and into the broader world of supply chain. With the end goal being that we will become a central hub for product development, not just execution of product design. So that was a very clear strategy. We did it from the start, and every metric we did, we put towards that. I would regularly walk the floor. I'd go into meeting rooms and ask people, what are you doing? Oh, we're doing our presentation deck. Well, who reads it? Nobody. And stop doing it. So it can be done even in those kind of unique transformational areas. That company went on to be nominated as one of the best places to work in Europe. It won the Shingo Prize for Ops Excellence, and it was identified by the World Economic Forum as one of the model sites for the 21st century. So even within an established company, with appropriate leadership and appropriate clarity of purpose, even with the risks that are inherent in life sciences, you still can get the chance to reinvent yourself. So my call out to the organization is, or the team on the call would be, don't think because you're in an industry which is somewhat conservative, that you have to be absolutely conservative. And you can still create, you can refurbish the bathroom even in an old house.
Very well, but indeed you can. Just as an anecdote, I was always told that there was another name for PowerPoints before it became everyday language. They were called visual aids, and they were to aid increasing, improving retention of what the person was saying. But you actually listen to a person explaining a story, born behind them by something that would trigger memory, right? Visual aids is a wonderful way of freshening thinking about PowerPoints rather than telling the story, right? So there's a lot more credibility with the individual telling a story, whether that sounds reasonable or not, especially, as you say, Peter, if you have the fact sheet and the data sheet behind that, that gives the whole story. Yeah?
So Andrew, what I wanted to say, and I don't know if this is an urban legend, but the story goes in Amazon that apparently years ago, when Bezos was basically getting a new presentation, a new proposal via PowerPoint, he basically said, "This is brilliant. We should be doing this. Can I get your kind of notes on what your sales plan is?" And the person didn't have this, and he got irritated. It's like, how can this be? I was about to make a decision, and I don't have the facts and figures. And so, it's a good example of you need to have both. And I still believe that Amazon has gone to an extreme of completely forbidding, like PowerPoint. There's probably somewhere in the middle where there is a use for both, to be honest. But I really like the culture of analytics, making sure you do your due diligence before you bring a proposal to the leadership team.
And that's one of the things that I recall you were saying that you really liked at Amazon, that aspect of things.
Yes. I don't know if you know, Andrew, but I don't know if you know how meetings go in Amazon, but it's really interesting. So you've got a leadership team meeting. Basically, the person who has a topic on the agenda walks in with a document, basically distributed to everybody. And we take a half an hour to read the document. And it's completely silent. You see people making notes next to the document. After a half an hour, the person that brings the topic to the table basically says, is everybody done with reading? Fine. And then any overall comments. And then, some people would speak up and say, I think this was a good document. It basically reflects well the highlights and some of the lowlights. And then you go page by page, and people have questions page by page. And at the end of the meeting, everybody's aligned about the document and next steps. It's really, really interesting. So people don't read stuff prior to the meeting. Bezos basically said once, who's got the time to do that? And so people read documents in the meeting. And then at the end of the meeting, it's so effective that everybody walks away, with a good understanding what is it that we're going to do next.
I can see people making a note now saying, must do this in my next meeting. I can feel it. I'm getting some of the questions coming through, obviously indicate that. And one of the things that is very, very strong in life sciences in general is this sense of purpose, a calling, as you described it, I think, Paul, in our early discussions. Can you maybe talk a little bit about that? Because that I'm finding difficult to relate to the Amazon business and the industrial business, that sense of purpose and doing good and patient health and so on. Can you talk to us a little bit about that?
Is that for me?
It's for you, Paul, absolutely.
Okay, thank you. Well, I think we mentioned even earlier on the call, Andrew, that the idea of being patient or disease-focused, obsessed.
Yes.
And Peter and I spoke about being in different industries. There's very few commercial industries that can create a calling beyond the P&L, right? We are true calling behind it, beyond the P&L. Life sciences would be one, maybe renewable energy. But when you go beyond that, you're really thinking about not-for-profit organizations or NGO organizations that have an emotional calling. I think the life sciences businesses are blessed with that opportunity to do that. And the conversation Peter and I have is, have they really made enough of that?
That's the question.
Have they really emphasized that enough? And my experience would be of yes, bringing the patient into the room and using the emotional pull. Shamelessly, I'll say the emotional pull of having a patient who's been treated well and got better because you turned up for work 3 months ago, you made a product, you distributed that product, and that person is now better and their children are happy and they're going to live longer. That's an incredible calling. I think where there's an opportunity to go beyond that, well, firstly, use it more and use it holistically. Depending where you go in the life sciences businesses, and I even saw within J&J, some businesses did it absolutely perfectly. Some businesses didn't do it. Okay? And some parts of businesses didn't do it. But going beyond that, so using it consistently, but also thinking about beyond the disease state, how you drive the maximum improvement in public health. And that's where I think the step between life sciences and healthcare, that whole ease of doing business, the customer-centric of the flow, getting the product in the right place at the right time, taking the cost out of healthcare so that more people can get processed through healthcare. I think that could be an even more enriching calling within the life sciences.
There's some learnings here in the opposite direction, I think, Paul, particularly when you start to look at cost structures and so on. I mean, I think when you hear the general about, pharma companies, life science making too much money, they're too spoiled, they've had it too easy for years. Whereas if you're in an industrial business or Amazon, for example, where your margins are really wafer thin, you can't afford to be complacent.
Yes.
Is there something to be done in pharma, for example, on that?
Yeah, the margin structure or the enduring life of the protected species, right? The patent structure creates a protected species, which can by itself protect margin. I think it can take away the energy of the need to go beyond addressing the disease state with a protectable technology. Yeah. So that's, I think, if you asked me the question, I think last week, what have I learned more of since I left J&J? Cash management. Absolute cash management. So in a smaller margin business, you're managing cash. So you're making decisions about how you allocate that cash appropriately and accordingly in a way that's going to allow you to capture more market share. Now, you could see that's a business venture, right? I'm trying to capture more market share. Is that a calling? Well, if you can equate that into a better provision of healthcare through better solution provision, through more investment in the engagement through the healthcare professional. And I'm not talking about training the doctors and nurses, that's done very well. I'm talking about the whole flow of material from all the way through to the end consumption. And the feedback loop, you use the big data to provide a feedback loop which will make that product even better. There's opportunity, and there's a lot in there to unpick, Andrew, but yes, that focused on cash management to make sure that you make the right investment structures, to build on the product leadership and think about the provision of the product through a bit more customer intimacy, which will allow that seamless integration between the life science business and the health center, the healthcare provider.
If you're thinking back now, you've both had such terrific careers and will doubtless continue to do so. And I think you're coming at it from a different direction, Paul and Peter, but you have a long, long way to go in your careers. May seem longer sometimes than you'd wish for, but you have a long, long way to go in those things. If you're looking back on the last years you've had, what are the things you would have done differently? Should we start with you, Peter? What would you have done differently in terms of running these businesses, in terms of HR and so on, that you've learned you would definitely do differently today in your former life?
Yeah, I think as I reflect a little bit, as I saw Amazon being successful and their culture being so strong and all that, and if I look back at my last years with Johnson & Johnson in the talent management space, one thing that I would have taken more seriously would have been the notion of the employee experience. So let's talk a little bit about that. The employee experience consists of 3 different experiences. One is the culture of the company and the experience that you have around working in that culture. The second one is the workplace in which you work. And the third one is the technology experience that you have working in this company. We talked a little bit about the culture component of life science. I mean, it's really good. It's impressive. There is a value proposition to work there. The credo is strong in terms of culture. But when you look at the workplace and the technology experience, it's really poor. And I honestly believe that healthcare has an opportunity to rethink their talent management strategy. I believe that they're going to have a problem in attracting the right talent for the future. Think about, the new generations. I have seen this in Amazon. People come, they take their dog to the workplace, they come in shorts, they eat in food trucks. It's a different world, Andrew. It's a completely different world. And now I'm going back years ago in life science where it's still very traditional. And so even my son, who was an intern at Johnson & Johnson, basically said that I don't want to work there forever. It's not the place I want to work. And I'm hearing this constantly from the millennials, the Generation Z. So I think they probably have an opportunity to rethink that employee experience component and in how are they going to attract talent and retain talent. So I think I see that really as a great opportunity. So I would have made that more a priority. I didn't see the writing on the wall when I was in life science.
Indeed, those were early days, Peter. Thank you. Paul, there's an interesting question came up from our audience just now concerning the ability to transform things like the employee experience that Peter's talking about. How, of course, the premise is it's much more difficult to do this where you've got major capital investments, lots of fixed assets. In theory, compared to Amazon, I think that's a misapprehension about Amazon, by the way. There's huge fixed assets in Amazon in one way or another. But, how would you go about that in a, heavy asset intensive business to make the kind of transformation that Peter describes?
Yeah, it is a challenge. So Goodyear is quite asset rich. Okay, we have a number of manufacturing plants which are large. I'd say an average tire manufacturing plant is over 100,000 square meters space. So they're big facilities, and the fixed asset cost is high. I think the challenge with anything, it's very easy to say I can't do it. I'm a big fan of setting your strategic goal out of where you want to be and understand where you are and then go about it methodically. You may not get the massive overnight change, but it could be a very exciting change journey. Just make sure you do it methodically. Don't set a strategy or a vision that no one else is aligned to. So back to using the document or the PowerPoint or the storytelling, make sure that the journey you're going on is going to create value to the business and to the employee. And it is just go about it methodically because it's a longer road. Refurbishing is a longer road than building from new, but it doesn't mean it's not just as rewarding.
Indeed. I am coming back to the same point that Peter responded to just now. Looking back, Paul, is there one specific thing or a couple of things you would have done differently in your earlier life had you known what you know today?
Yeah, I think so. And I think it comes back to my answer 2 ago when we talked about the integration between life sciences and healthcare. I will tell you that within Goodyear, or within J&J, as an ops leader, if you wanted to get to the higher rungs of operations leadership, you went through the manufacturing flow. Okay, so everything else was almost subservient to manufacturing. And that's heavily linked to the concept of we are product leaders. Therefore, the integration between R&D and manufacturing creates that product leadership position. So I was probably less ready for the logistical space until I came to Goodyear. And in retrospect, I think that's an area I could have spent more time in, should have spent more time in, and it's a value that we left untouched. Back to that prior conversation, because that allows me to expand the customer base to include the user as well as the consumer, the patient, and it allows me to think about creating value in healthcare, which is broader than value in disease state.
Yeah, and you know, when you're looking, this is a point to both of you. A question came up just now from our audience. You know, would you agree with the statement that it's easier to apply things in Amazon because it's a lot less highly regulated, where there's less health and safety risk than it would be like in life sciences? Is that a statement you'd agree with? A lot easier to do it in Amazon than it would be in life sciences?
Maybe I can take this one. So yeah. I don't know if you guys know, but Amazon is investing in healthcare. They bought, for instance, PhilPack is a new online pharmaceutical pharmacy, right? And so that compliance rigor is definitely going to also apply to Amazon in the future. But I can tell you that there was a lot of rigor in place already. Just think about that. If somewhere a customer in the world, think about it, complains about buying a wrong product on Amazon, we immediately had to take action. So we had the system in place called Heartbeat that would basically, you know, make an inventory of all the comments that our customers are making instantaneously in all kinds of languages in all parts of the world, and immediately transfer that into actionable insights. Like, for instance, somebody says, you know, I have a kind of an allergic reaction to the cream I just bought on Amazon. We immediately had to take action. And so I wouldn't basically put it that black and white that the regulatory, you know, compliance issues are a different order. I think they are a different order, but they're still high at Amazon, and they will become higher as they're moving into healthcare.
Very good point. Is that your perspective too, Paul? I mean, surely there is not that much difference between the two. That's at least what I'm understanding from what Peter's saying.
No, I think if I think about the tire space, it's more or less as regulated as the life science space, because something goes wrong with the tire, it can lead to the same kind of issue. I do agree with whoever posed the question that the risk of life, reputation, and livelihood within the life sciences can be pretty large. If you've made a mistake, a whole business unit can shut down if you've made a critical mistake. So I do agree that the risks are high. One of the things we started to talk about in J&J was what would you do if you weren't afraid? Because I think when you focus only on the risk, all you see is the storm cloud, right? So I agree with whoever said it, that it is massive risk, but it doesn't mean that everyone else is not suffering from the same, from similar risks, maybe not as extreme, but similar risks.
Yes.
I think what I'd encourage, and I do it to my team still every day, is don't just focus on the risk, focus on the opportunity, and don't spend as much time thinking on what you can do to get it right first time as what you'll do if it goes wrong eventually.
Right. Very good sage words. Thank you very much. I think with that, Paul and Peter, we're going to bring this session to a close, unless we're missing anything that you in particular wanted to impart at this phase. But I think we've covered a huge amount of really good material. We've answered many of the questions from our audience. And I'm so grateful for having had those great insights from you, Paul, and also from Peter. I also want to thank our audience who stayed with us all the way through this session and have no doubt been making notes furiously. Just to let you know too that recording of this session will be available for everybody within the next 48 hours. And you can see that in front of you now, the catch-up page at borderless.net, Borderless Live Catch-up. And of course, any comments or any feedback to us on this session or any questions to our wonderful guests, address that to live@borderless.net and we'll make sure it gets answered. So we look forward to welcoming you back again for another session. In the meantime, a special thank you to Paul and a special thank you to Peter for sharing your life experiences in very different worlds and how that applies to life sciences and vice versa. Thank you. See you again soon.